Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us live on a Tuesday morning. Lynn Klein, I see you already in the chat. Thank you for that. We have a very special guest with us today, and Jack will introduce our guest since you texted him last night and brought Rick Lanman in. And do you want to proceed with the introduction or go with your humorous intro?
Gosh, what a good question. Do you have the guest stand there saying, what the hell is this? Or do I say that Rick Lanman, who's a retired MD, runs the Institute for Historical Ecology and is an incredible researcher? I once had a conversation with Rick. I won't name the publication, but a publication was not allowing him to be published in their magazine to the common man. And Rick has been extensively published. He'll sing his praises, I hope, a little bit more when we bring him on. So he's here and filling in, by the way, today, folks. We were supposed to have Heather King, the owl queen, an owl and wildlife photographer in Canada, but she couldn't make it today. And Rick was gracious enough to jump in at the last minute here. He and I were talking yesterday, and he knows a lot about Point Reyes and into the meat of the show, the vegan meat of the show. But I did want to do our little bit of a warm-up with a couple very short, humorous things, because the rest of the show won't be as hilarious. But this stuff is great, and then we will bring Rick in and get to it for the bulk of the show today. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Good morning, Lynn. So,
no audio. Went through this.
No audio?
Correct.
Hang on.
Happened last time, and you found a fix on your end.
Yeah. I talk amongst yourselves. I'm on it. Video file.
So, Rick, I was excited to see that you have done a talk about the Tule elk in the past to the Mount Diablo organization. And while Jack's working on that, I'll go ahead and ask, did I, in just the short part at the beginning, did I hear that the elk were put in places and then they naturally moved to big sources of water, like reservoirs?
Yes, you did hear that correctly. Interestingly, Hewlett and Packard bought a ranch on Mount Hamilton in the Diablo Range in Santa Clara County, and CDFW gave them Tule elk in 1978. They kept them in a corral for 6 months to acclimatize and check for health. And then when they released them, they went 15, 20 miles north to San Antonio Reservoir at Sunol. They tried to get in 79 and they went east. They tried to get in 1980. They went southeast about 30 miles to San Luis Reservoir. And they tried in a fourth and final year, and they kept them penned for a year until they calved. And that time they stayed. And those are the Tule elk you see today when you drive from San Jose south on Highway 101 through Coyote Valley. They stayed in those foothills. However, as soon as the Silicon Valley Golf Course closed during the drought because they couldn't pay the expensive water bill, the elk herd moved right into Silicon Valley Golf Course, which is it's in the city limits of San Jose. So in the Diablo Range, it always was hot and dry, but as you know, it's getting hotter and drier, and they're heading for water, especially in the late summer and fall when our non-native Eurasian grasses get desiccated.
I find this interesting because one of our usual viewers, John Spear, who's an ally fighting for Point Reyes, has pointed out that the Tomales Point territory that the elk were given is actually kind of like high and dry, not really ideal conditions. And if what you're saying is that they gravitate toward water, which is what Julie Phillips said in a film that I did about the Tule elk, that's where she sees them hanging out. It's like they were forced into making the best that they could out of habitat that really wasn't ideal, but it's been proclaimed as ideal habitat that was given to them.
Well, I actually think it's pretty. So it's really not. They're not going to the reservoirs to drink the water. They're going for the green up. That is, as the reservoirs recede in late summer and fall, you get out of the mud that gets exposed. You get these green plants. So they're trying to find plants that have enough water content And I think they're getting that even at Tomales Point, until it got, until they probably approached the carrying capacity, and then of course they got decimated in the drought years. It was just tragic. But the doubling time for the Tule elk on Tomales Point for the population to double is 3.6 years. This is a faster doubling time by far than the Diablo Range, where they've only increased 35% over 40 years versus 100% in 3.5 years. So it's pretty good habitat. Their home range to support a herd, although herd sizes can be super variable, is only about 500 acres at Point Reyes, but at Mount Hamilton, it's easily twice that. And if you go
there's no hunting, there's no hunting taking place at these other areas, or regulating being done by Fish and Wildlife that's affecting that population that you're talking about.
There is no sanctioned hunting in the Diablo Range on some of these places, but we know there's poaching. And I think the poaching is an unmeasurable unknown, but we have stumbled into an elk skeleton graveyard where there's lots of elk skeletons, but no horns.
Oh, jeez. Wow.
So wow. That they're being poached. I actually don't think it's the ranchers doing the poaching. I think it's yahoos from the city that go out on their ATVs. But Hewlett Packard also got pronghorn, which will be relevant to our Point Reyes discussion. And they gradually died out. And I think the fences systematically killed the pronghorn that were translocated to Mount Hamilton to the Hewlett Packard Ranch.
Through habitat fragmentation or actual entanglement?
Actual entanglement.
Wow.
I think the fences at Point Reyes are probably killing 3 dozen deer and elk fawns a year. And if they ever got pronghorn, they would suffer even more, because even though they can jump, they don't know that they're supposed to go over a fence. So they try to go under or through, and they get tangled even more.
Jim Cota has pointed out that if that they need to have a higher level at the bottom and lower at the top for it to be wildlife friendly there, for the bigger animals and for something like a pronghorn to go under.
As opposed to the lot of fences, including new ones, that I was standing out there once with Jim Cota, and he was explaining the fence heights to me. I was getting educated by the great Jim Cota. And there was some that were 5 strings of barbed wire. The first one was like 12 inches off the ground, not 18 or 20 inches off the ground. And the top string was like eye level for me, versus at most 48 inches. And Rick, do you know the numbers? Do you have a suggested number for the lowest wire and the highest wire, if you're going to have fences at all? And we should have none in Point Reyes, by the way.
I don't know them offhand.
Okay, that's okay. I just thought you might.
I can, but they're clearly, there's wildlife friendly fence designs that are recommended by Department of Wildlife in Wyoming and Montana. And they're the same. And
but this is moot for Point Reyes, is it not? Because there should be no fences in Point Reyes Seashore, right?
Yeah, I mean, why do we even need the fences if there's
there you go.
If you don't have to partition the ranches, except I don't know what the roadkill situation is. I don't know if there's places where there's high-speed traffic, but I don't think so. I don't think you need fences.
35 mph, as far as I know, is the highest posted speed. And if it were up to me, even though I drive 35 or 40 in the park, thinking I know what I'm doing, I'd happily accept 20 mph speed limit, radar tested, and everyone just goes slow in there and looks at the animals like duh.
People do speed in Point Reyes, and it's unfortunate. I get really mad when I see it, but cattle are beyond their fences all the time out there. So people know how to slow down for cattle. You can slow down for the elk.
Yeah.
All of a sudden we have to have fences because of the elk, but you didn't give a crap that the cattle were always blocking the roads, especially on the way out the Chimney Rock.
Exactly. So if I can back up for a second, just kind of give what we're going to do in this show and why we're here and why Rick is helping us. Appreciate your presence here. So because 12 of the 14 ranches are out of Point Reyes, freeing up about 17,000 acres supposedly, which is now open to the Tule elk, pictured in this photo on the screen here. This is from Turtle Island Restoration Network. Now executive director is Ken Boulay. recently issued, this is February of last year, so just whatever, 6-7 months ago, a report review of 7 mammalian species that our guest Rick Lanman knows a great deal about for potential reintroduction to Point Reyes seashore. And just the overview is a new report takes a bold examination at what rewilding could mean for the seashore. There's a separate report here, review of 7 mammalian species, which Skyward is going to put into the link if people want to kind of read in detail what Rick's going to be talking about today. And this is focusing on the potential reintroduction of locally eliminated and functionally absent mammals. Report explores how carefully planned restoration efforts could help return the landscape to a more resilient, historically rooted ecosystem. And then we talk about keystone species. We're going to get into that with Rick as well, like sea otter, an ecosystem engineer, and the North American beaver is the ecosystem engineer. And the analysis considers how strategic reintroductions might restore trophic cascades, strengthen biodiversity, and build on past successes, like the, says here 1980, I have in my head 1978 return of the Tule elk to the seashore. And this report, in fact, was co-authored by our guest today, whom we're lucky to have. Thank you to Rick Lanman, MD of the Institute for Historical Ecology in Los Altos, where he's sitting right now. So that's what we're doing today. That report that's mentioned here, I do have on the screen as well, with Turtle Island's name on the top of it. It's review of 7 species for potential reintroduction to Point Reyes, and this goes on and on. We can provide a link to this.
I just put the link in the chat, and I also added it to the video description for those who want to look at it themselves.
And just because I'm a photographer and a sucker for this stuff, we may come back to this later, but I did want to show who we're talking about here. So that is a pronghorn, and Rick's going to perhaps talk about those. The 3 species I was thinking we might talk about, and I think Rick's, I'm going to stop talking in just a minute, I promise, but sea otter, different from the river otters that are in Abbott's Lagoon at the moment. Just, you know, for me as an activist, like, can we advocate for these animals? I think the public will like to see these animals at Point Reyes, pronghorn, sorry. And then, of course, the beaver is not in Point Reyes seashore, but could be introduced. And there's a discussion now with many people having different opinions, but Rick is one opinion I value highly. And thanks for that. Letting me do the intro. Let's get into it.
Terrific. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, Skyward or Rick, do you know where you'd like to start with either those 3 species or just an overview of what?
I can't wait to hear about the rivers, the otters and the beavers. It's eating away at me to mention that I was just out at Point Reyes last week taking footage of the land, and that it's all still covered in barbed wire fences. And they're simultaneously like declaring that the elk have been free and the ranchers have been evicted. But I saw cattle everywhere. Fences are still up. And there's supposedly this brag about using electronic fences for the cattle, but they haven't bothered to take down all the habitat fragmentation. So just getting that off my chest, where the Point Reyes National Seashore Park Service priorities are.
And Rick was just saying that those old rusty barbed wire fences, and there's a couple 100 miles at least all over the park, are still, yes, Rick, a threat to any mammal that tries to jump them, which includes elk and deer at the moment, correct?
Yes. So there's a national wildlife refuge, Hart Mountain antelope, which is a misnomer. They're not antelope. They're pronghorn, but it's Hart Mountain Antelope National Wildlife Refuge, where a volunteer organization, ONDA, Oregon, and is I think Northern Desert Association. They've been volunteering for 40 years to remove fences from that wildlife refuge after it was acquired, and it was, of course, historically a cattle ranch. And over the 40 years, as they removed the fence, the pronghorn population just took off, just soared. Wow. So there's good data. But although a bull elk could belly flop on a barbed wire fence with impunity, and just elk fawns, black-tailed deer fawns, I believe, are getting killed probably by the dozens every year at Point Reyes right now.
Wow.
And we have footage of them laying dead to the fence with it wrapped in the antlers.
Yeah. So I'm a physician scientist. I mostly live in the scientific world. I have over 300 peer-reviewed scientific publications. But I was asked by Turtle Island Restoration Network when one of their interns, Alexis Evripoudou, surveyed 15, 20 regional ecologists, wildlife biologists. Now that the land's available at Point Reyes, what would we, of the mammal species, which ones would we should we consider rewilding it with, reintroducing animals that used to be there but are now extirpated? And that's how we got the list of 7. And then we asked, what ecosystem services do they provide? Sea otter and beaver come at the top of that list.
Just to include every walk of life of our audience, explain to people what ecosystem services are, if you don't mind.
Sure. How do they help other species and plants and basically do a lot of the restoration work for free? So when elk are our large native grazer, if you just remove the cattle and you don't get elk back, those black-tailed deer are not enough to stop the chaparral from taking over, and then eventually oak woodlands would move in, and there would be no more coastal prairie at Point Reyes in time. But if you have elk, they mow the grass for free. They do a little grazing also. They're not just grazers which eat grasses and forbs or flowers, but they do browse, which deer mostly do on shrubbery, but they mow the grass for free. Elk and beaver are actually our 2 native mammals that help us fight fires. Elk by reducing fire fuel loads so that the canopy of the forest or the tree doesn't ignite, and beaver because a string of beaver ponds can act like as a barrier to a wildfire, or if it fails at a barrier, at least a water source for firefighters.
Let me jump in, Rick. For beaver are not at Point Reyes, and there was some accolade about it's the only species that's not there or is not in California. Just tell a little bit more about the beaver's place, where it was or used to be there.
So Fish and Wildlife was hewing to this the wrong notion that beaver only ever lived in California in the Central Valley, in the Delta. And that was just based on Joseph Grinnell, the first museum director at Berkeley's Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, who's writing in the 1930s and says, the only place there are beaver in the Central Valley. So I met an archaeologist who had found a buried beaver dam in the Sierra Nevada. And we radiocarbon dated the sticks, and wow, this gets wiped out around 1850, right when the 49ers would have arrived.
What do you know?
Surprise!
But our coast was stripped earlier, right? The Russians came down to hunt sea otter, and they would give the local tribes, metal tools and frying pans and all kinds of useful in exchange for furs, for pelts. So the Boston whalers were also here doing the same thing. In fact, the Russians would pay the Boston whalers to run the Golden Gate gauntlet, risk the Spanish cannons to get into the bay to hunt sea otter. The sea otter used to be filled with, the San Francisco Bay used to be filled with sea otter. So sea otter and beaver stripped from the coast, mink, fisher, marten, all these fur-bearing mammals stripped from the coast before the Anglo-Europeans are even here. So the next was I had to prove that beaver were native to the coast. And I look and look, and there's no museum records in California of beaver. And then it finally dawns on me that we didn't even have museums. And in 1906, we lost the only 2 museums we built in 1906.
In the fire.
Yeah.
In the fire.
The 1906 earthquake and fire levels the California Academy of Sciences and burns it. Stanford had the other natural history museum, and it was destroyed, but some of their zoology collection survived. And they never rebuilt it, but they gave what they had left went to the California Academy of Sciences when it was rebuilt in 1908. So I finally say, I got to look out of state, and I found a beaver skull in the Smithsonian in a Chumash canoe from 1855 in Saratoga Creek, about 15 miles from my house, which was the first physical proof of beaver in a coastal watershed. Then I find a tooth up on Randall Creek in South Humboldt County on the beach. Then another skull in Berkeley's Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, but which Grinnell had suppressed because it just didn't fit in his mental mindset that beaver could live in Southern California in a coastal watershed. That was Sespe Creek, a tributary of the Santa Clara River that comes out at Ventura. So we, Brock Dolman, Kate Lundquist, myself, Heidi Perriman, founded Wertha Dam in Martinez to protect the beaver there. And Michael Pollack, a NOAA National Marine Fisheries scientist. And then we find all the tribes had words for beaver: the Bodega Miwok, the Pomo, the Kashaya Pomo, the South. All the tribes up and down the coast had words for beaver. We wrote this paper in 2013. Looks like beaver were native to the entire coast of California. So the notion that they were only Central Valley was wrong. And they provide this fabulous ecosystem service. Their beaver ponds are, they increase steelhead survival about 200-fold. Because it's
how do they do that? How do they do that?
The beaver ponds are insect smorgasbords for trout and salmon. And it's also sheltered, slow-moving water until they can get big enough to go out to sea. So they're much larger when they go out to sea if they get a chance to grow up in a beaver pond. So you've got firefighting, you've got this impact on fishes, and then you've got all kinds of amphibians. California red-legged frogs love beaver ponds. California tiger salamander, the list goes. And then you've got obligate birds who need willow next to water, like Southwest willow flycatcher. Did they range that as far north as Point Reyes? Not sure, but you name it, birds, amphibians, mammals, mink, they depend on these beaver ponds.
Help a poor layman. This is just from beaver. For instance, if you introduce them into the Limantour Muddy Hollow area of Point Reyes, they would turn some of those seasonal smaller streams into ponds. They're dam builders. They would have a pond, and then all the rich wildlife you just described would have a place to live and exist.
My whole interest in beaver started because I was trying to figure out why the creek behind my house. When I bought my house in 1987 from an 80-year-old gentleman, he said he used to fly fish in the creek year-round. I'm like, how could that be true? Because now the creek is dry half the year. So one of my theories was maybe there were beaver ponds. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Jack. A beaver pond is like a flood retention basin. It will raise the water table so that in our dry summer and fall, that high water table then can nourish the creek and turn a seasonal or intermittent or ephemeral creek into a perennial one, or at least the ponds could be perennial water sources for all kinds of species. So really valuable in terms of restoring the ecosystem.
And speaking of really valuable, the other political consideration here, I guess I'd call it, is that you as a scientist can dig into, do your research with whatever museums and books you can find and fossil remains. And by proving that, yes, and writing a paper and getting it published and having it respected and peer reviewed, then the Park Service will say, oh, okay, we can consider reintroducing them, because if it wasn't here to begin with, we won't consider a reintroduction. So your work is critical to reintroducing certain species we'd like to get back in, right?
I find it discouraging that people like Rick have to do what the people that were already being paid should have done correctly. Like, are they just that bad at their jobs, or are they intentionally not seeing these things so that other things that are in the works can proceed?
So we're victims of shifting baseline syndrome, right? Biologists tend to believe in the shifting that the world always was the way it was when the biologist was a little kid. So
right. Right.
Yeah. Huge.
We had 1,000 Chinook salmon run up through downtown San Jose last year, and they've been running in this river, hundreds of salmon for decades. But it was outside what people considered to be Chinook salmon territory. The southern limits for coastal Chinook is the Russian River, not San Jose, California, right? So we had find salmonid bone remains and do ancient DNA to prove they were Chinook, and then publish it in a peer-reviewed science. So the Park Service is doing what the scientists say and the fish and wildlife experts, but what they say is based on biologists that wrote by us, right? Anglo-European colonists that took the state over from the Spanish, and they didn't even have museums for 150 years. So I think we were literally rewriting the historic range of many species, Chinook, elk, salmon, in our work in our institute. But it took 10 years after we published the paper proving beaver were native to the Sierra with radiocarbon sticks from a chewed up beaver dam. It took 10 years before CDFW started to translocate beaver again to establish
10 years after you published that information.
It took 10 years. So, I mean, beaver have pluses and minuses, right? If once you have a city, they cause floods, they flood roads. There's ways to manage those problems. In a place like Point Reyes, where it's mostly wilderness, you don't have that downside.
So you're a strong advocate for, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting. You're a strong advocate then, beaver at Point Reyes, you don't see any downside. You see upside and no downside? Is that what you're saying?
I don't see any downside. They're missing piece of the ecological balance. It will enhance bird diversity, mammal diversity, fish, salmonid success, amphibian. It may not eliminate wildfire, but it may help slow their spread if there's some structures or something people want to protect. I don't see downside.
And just a quick question for me, the layman. You science folks or biologists say salmonids or salmonids rather than salmon. Is that to cover multiple species of salmon? Is that why you do that?
We say salmon. I say salmonid, and that's because steelhead trout genetically are closer to salmon and share the same genus now, which was a big change. We thought they were just trout, but they're actually more like salmon. Cutthroat trout are salmonids. Whitefish are salmonids. It's a big category, but our several salmon species and steelhead are the main ones that would be related to Point Reyes area.
Thank you. And how do you say potato?
Yeah. I'm from Indiana, so I say potato.
Sorry, Skylar, you had something.
Well, you talked about breaking up a leaping fire by there being more bodies of water as one way that would happen. What about something as simplistic as more water spread over further areas so that the vegetation isn't as dry or the soil is moister? I mean,
absolutely.
Does that apply?
Absolutely. So a string of beaver ponds often won't stop a wildfire, but it will create a refuge for wildlife during the fire. And you'll see these photos where the forest is burned to the ground on both sides of the creek, but where there's beaver ponds, there's, as you described, I think, Skylar, right, a band of green vegetation. So the water next to the beaver pond not only can grow further out, but it's really well hydrated vegetation. It's just less likely to burn. This is really important for everything from insects to large mammals can seek refuge in wildfires in these in the pond itself, but also in that riparian zone around it.
Wow.
And going back to what I said at the beginning, I just want to make sure that people understand I didn't mean to make Julie sound incorrect. She did, in fact, point out the vegetation that grows around those riparian areas. She didn't specifically say they were there just to drink. She said that they were there for the vegetation that is possible thanks to the water sources, as you pointed out. Right.
Yeah, they may wipe out that vegetation if beaver are successful. Right, of the four main predators of beaver: wolves, coyote, puma, and what am I leaving out? Bear. You only have puma and coyote, so they could overpopulate. But you know what they do? They leave. They'll go down to the ocean, and swim through the salt water and go up the next stream.
Wow.
And then
Also, they'll attract we always wonder about what predators we should reintroduce. If you put beavers in there, doesn't that attract whatever predators nature and her wisdom would, all of a sudden the bear will stick around because they've got a food source, as opposed to wandering through, there's no food here, right?
Yeah. The first translocation that CDFW did with beaver was for the mountain Maidu in the northern Sierra Nevada. They just tried it again with the Tule River tribe in the central Sierra, and it failed. It failed because the black bears ate all the beaver they released.
Wow. Were there more black bear there than there are? I think there's one or two occasionally wander through Point Reyes, but not as many.
Yeah, you don't have a resident population. I mean, when I say resident, I mean
population.
You don't have evidence of bear cubs yet, but they're in Marin now with cubs, and they're on their way.
Ranchers will bring that to an end.
It'll just be so they pass through. You have transient. I'm not sure you have breeding puma either. I think they're just transient, but beaver will just move. They're amphibious. They can go over land or by sea to find the next stream, and then they can move back when things grow back.
So we've talked about a connection between the beaver and the elk already, even though we didn't mean to. And I don't want to derail us, but I've got to ask you, when you talk about the elk being grazers, mowing the grass, and that being a potential reduction of fire fuel intensity.
Correct.
How do you counter when the ranchers say, well, that's what the cattle are doing, and that's why the cattle are important, versus how elk do it being different from how cattle do it, and why we should use elk to do it instead of using cattle to do it?
Well, cattle do. Cattle are Eurasia's large native grazer. We have elk and bison. They have cattle and bison. Hardly any bison left in Eurasia, but they have those. So they do, but they don't belong in national park units.
Well, more specific,
or do they do it differently?
So there are some subtle differences. The cattle may, in Pacheco State Park, west of St. Louis Reservoir, elk are now high density, and the perennial bunch grasses are coming back. So cattle removed, I'm not sure how long ago, maybe 15, 20 years, but then it takes a little while for the elk population, I think, to build up. Elk nip the grass at the top. They don't uproot it. They don't eat it all the way to the bare dirt. And two things happen. One, the root system gets several times larger. A lot of carbon gets sequestered in these natural native bunch grass systems where they're being grazed. By elk. Whereas cattle may wrap their tongue around the bunch grass and pull it up, especially when it's wet and muddy, and then it's gone. And then Eurasian grasses take over. So cattle and Eurasian grass, native, non-native annual grasses go well together, but our perennial bunch grass. So this is subtle, I think, but my issue on the San Francisco Peninsula, we have elk east of 101. They can't cross 101 to the west, but these land trusts keep buying land, and they remove the cattle, and then they aren't working to bring the elk back to. But at any rate, so no, cattle do reduce fire fuel loads, but you're not going to get the ecological balance you get after millions of years of elk. And
right. They have a temporary and short-sighted benefit. But you just talked about, Laura Cunningham loves to talk about what you just talked about because she's a bunch grass fan. She talks about the deep root system and the sequestration. And she's talked about how cattle will actually rip those up out of the ground. You talked about, this is exactly what I was after, a description of how a native animal grazes differently. The native animal does not prevent the return of a native plant or the continued survival of that beneficial native plant. The elk allow the native perennial bunch grass to live and grow there even as they're grazing, whereas the cattle bring that to an end. That's exactly
in addition, let me know, Rick, if I got any of this wrong. This is from my conversations over the years now with Laura Cunningham and Julie Phillips, two biologists who have been in the Point Reyes issue. Cows are much larger, heavier mammals. They are bred, hyperbred, so they're more stationary. And yeah, that's why you can rotationally graze them and move them around with shock collars and all that, but they move less. They're grazers who eat grass down to the dirt more likely than browser grazers, which are the pronghorn and the elk and the deer we prefer. They also create a huge amount more manure, coating the land with much more manure. Then there's cute little pellets that come out of deer that you see in the park that have very low impact for smothering vegetation and being washed into waterways to pollute with manure. And of course, ultimately, they're an extractive animal. They're raised for profit, so they're removed from the land, as opposed to wild animal carcasses dying on the land and degrading back into the soil. Those are huge differences, not subtle at all, in my opinion, right? Do I have any of that wrong?
I'm not expert enough to comment on that, but
okay.
You unleashed a thought that I have to share. Since we talked about cattle and scat, it's really interesting because a study was just published that by Tina Saitoni at UC Davis. They looked at wolf scat in the Sierras, and it was 72% cattle. And what shocked me is that wolves in Central Europe, where they were never wiped out, and cattle, which are native there, if you look at the wolf scat there, it's only 3% cattle. And you don't have to kill wolves to protect cattle. You just have to stop using wolves. Cattle that don't have horns, right? So the difference is in Europe, are native and they still have horns. And guess what? Cattle with horns don't get eaten by wolves. It is
wow.
Where is Fish and Wildlife? Where are the environmental journalists? Why isn't anybody talking about this? As a scientist, I read this paper and it says, we think it's because cattle have horns. So why don't our cattle have horns? Because we use concentrated animal feedlot operations, right? To be organic beef in Europe, you have to be open pasture your whole life. But you're still organic here if you spend your last 120 days or less in a CAFO, a concentrated animal feedlot operation. And if you're concentrated together, it's not good to have horns because they will gore each other. But in open pasture, they don't.
Wow.
So anyway,
I love this.
The scat and the DNA analysis in Europe, to me, it just blew my mind. We have a simple solution. People need to tell their ranchers, in Switzerland, there are breeds of dairy cattle that have horns. And somehow they manage it. They don't all kill each other, and it's a highly sought after milk product and cheese product that they produce. So anyway,
no, not anyway, Rick. That's huge. Skylar and I, apparently by Skylar's reaction to mine, like, oh my God, that's so freaking obvious. And it never, this is the beauty of conversation. Like in the old days before AI took over and chatbots, like I was at a farm sanctuary and I just met this Gertie, this sweet dairy cow that's been rescued and won't die at year one. She's about 6 or 7 months old now. And she has like these 3-inch horns. Females, cows have horns. I did not know this. And you got to be careful when you're petting her. She likes to play and she'll kind of put her head up and, hit you with a friggin' horn behind her 700-pound young animal body. And like, oh my God, that would defend against wolves. Who knew? And it's just, oh, by the way, as a vegan activist, also an animal rights activist, by the way, it's torturing a cow to cauterize, to burn off the freaking horns on a baby cow. Never even considered in the whole world of, dairy and beef ranching. Oh my God.
It may have been a revelation to us just now to hear that, but it shouldn't have been, which brings me back to, is this information intentionally being held back, or the people in charge that we trust to be doing this work that incompetent?
Both. How about both?
It's easy to be blind. It just seems to be human nature. I racked my brain for 20 years. How do we solve this wolf problem? We knew they were coming to California. It was just a matter of time because after they returned to Glacier naturally, then they added them to Yellowstone and parts of Idaho, and then 10 years later they reached Eastern Washington and then Eastern Oregon, and it was just a matter of time till they reached California. But cattle without horns are sitting ducks for wolves. The wolves must be just saying thank you. This is like an In-N-Out burger.
Wow.
we should
Anyway.
touch.
Anyway,
We should touch
so
on
people ask us,
another
why
animal.
don't we introduce wolves to Point Reyes?
Hmm.
And I think it's just, we might need them in time, but right now there's not enough elk density. Elk are their preferred prey. 70-75% of their diet is elk normally. They do take black-tailed deer, which is a form of mule deer, or a subspecies of mule deer, but we don't need them yet. They may find their way down on their own by the time the elk reach that population threshold.
And also, don't they need a lot of territory? And also, aren't humans terrified of them? You know, because they're going to range beyond the boundaries of the park and then freak people out who are terrified about wild animal predators, right?
Yeah, they are. Although they were never wiped out in like Western Poland, Eastern Germany, and they somehow ranching and farming survives.
It's not a wolf problem; it's a human problem. Sorry, Skyward, go.
If I were to take what you just said about the importance of horns on cattle against wolves, but wolves eat elk, then I would have to say that you're talking about eating female and young, because obviously bull elk have horns, yet female elk don't, like dairy cows do.
So you are right. They prefer fawns. Much safer to take a fawn who doesn't have horns yet. They love to get the does. The cows. Elk. We use the word cow for the females. When the males lose their horns, because they grow new horns every year, in Yellowstone, the wolves go after the bulls when they lose them. They also go after the bulls in winter when they get stuck in the snow and they can't turn around and use their horns. So in snow, in deep snow, elk is kind of stuck. But good data published on the wolves. They reach Yellowstone, and the bulls start growing new antlers earlier and earlier in the year before the snow melts. It really looks like it was, coevolution between wolves and elk.
Fascinating. That's pretty fast too.
So was a great question, Skylar. You're asking questions that took me years even to think of the question.
Skyward Thomas, baby. Skyward Thomas, don't mess with this guy. He'll carve you a brand new essay. I also wanted to touch on, I'm cutting you off there, I'm not meaning to, but sea otters. And were they here, and what's the benefit of reintroducing sea otters to the seashore, if that were possible?
I would say sea otter would be my number one choice of the 7 mammals, because they drive a trophic cascade. So a trophic cascade is when an animal, usually a predator, eats another animal, knocks its prevalence down, and allows plants to grow. So as you know, sea otter, we thought the southern sea otter was wiped out until they discover a small population in the Big Sur, a remnant population of several rafts of sea otter down in the middle of the Big Sur. In 1938, Life magazine, sea otter still here, not gone. Southern sea otter. Southern sea otter was from middle of Oregon's coast to the middle of Baja California. Now they're restricted just to the central range, from Point Ano Nuevo, Santa Cruz, down to Point Conception, Santa Barbara.
How'd that happen?
Well, they gradually expand from the Big Sur. In the 1960s, they reached Monterey Bay. In Monterey Bay, the kelp forest had been lost. The sardine and anchovy populations were gone because in the absence of sea otter, purple sea urchins thrive. Purple sea urchins eat the footholds for the kelp. When the sea otter came back, they ate the sea urchins. The kelp forest came back in Monterey Bay. When the kelp forest came back, it adds as a nursery for sardines and anchovies. Now you have fin fish eating whales like humpback whales and right whales in Monterey Bay. They haven't been there for decades. So this whole trophic cascade. In 2014, sea stars, the other purple sea urchin predator, gets wiped out by a bacteria, Vibrio, Vibrio. And the kelp forest, 95% of our kelp forests on the northern California coast are lost. So the two predators of the purple sea urchin are gone. And we've lost all that carbon. We've lost the kelp forest, which is a nursery for finfishes, Dungeness crabs, all kinds of invertebrates.
And sea otters, where they can hide from shark predators, correct?
Yeah,
Is that the purpose of kelp forest for sea otters?
Yeah, so by restoring the kelp forest, it gives them freedom from shark. The sea otter were on their way to the Golden Gate until the elephant seals came back to Ano Nuevo. And when the elephant seals came back to Ano Nuevo, the great white sharks came back.
Right.
The great white sharks, they don't consume sea otter. They bite them accidentally, and then there's no blubber here, and they spit them out, and they bleed out and die. But the sea otter range is now contracting. The sea otter, the southern sea otter, has been federally listed as threatened since 1977. That is 49 years ago. There's only been one translocation by U.S. Fish and Wildlife outside the Central Coast, and that's to San Nicolas Island, one of the outlying Channel Island. They actually thought it failed because that was in 1987 and 1990, almost 40 years ago, and 90% of them left that they translocated to San Nicolas Island. Most of them made it back to the mainland. They have high fidelity for their home. But the 10 to 20 that hung on are now up to 140, and it's taking off now as they reach that critical mass. We need to translocate sea otter, southern sea otter, to the northern California coast so they can restore our kelp forests by getting the sea urchins back in balance.
They can do that despite the bacteria problem?
The sea star, the bacteria hit the sea stars, which ate the sea urchins. But the sea otter is not affected by that. The sea otter are affected by toxoplasmosis, which, for those that keep cats and flush their kitty litter down their toilet, cats eat mice. Cats acquire toxoplasmosis, but it doesn't kill them. They excrete it into the kitty litter, and if we flush it down the toilet, it gets in the brains of sea otters and kills them. But no. So the bacteria just kills the sea stars. But so the sea otter, U.S. Fish and Wildlife did a feasibility study. It was driven by Jared Huffman, the Marin County congressman, who Congress passed an act that Fish and Wildlife needed to do a feasibility study. Why? They've been listed federally for almost 50 years. There's only one translocation outside of the Central Coast region in San Nicolas Island. Why don't we restore them to the south coast of California or the north coast of California? Or San Francisco Bay, for that matter. And they do a feasibility study, and they say, estuaries would be a great place to put sea otter. So Monterey Bay gets orphaned sea otter. Monterey Bay Aquarium gets orphaned sea otter. They raise them with their in-house adult females. The beauty of these baby sea otters, they don't know where they were born. So they're not going to be like the San Nicolas Island. You can put them anywhere, and they'll stay. Unlike the San Nicolas Island translocation, where they wanted to go home, and they swam a long way back to get to the coast. So they put these baby sea otter in Elkhorn Slough for a little while. There already was a male colony. They put some females of these orphan pups that they raised at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And now there's a thriving population in the Elkhorn Slough estuary by Moss Landing. No sharks there. And it's prey rich. These aren't prying abalone or eating. They're not prying abalone off rocks. They are digging for clams and eating crabs in that estuary.
Two questions. Why are there no sharks there? And then more importantly, up here, does the commercial oyster industry threaten any of these reintroductions?
So first, the great white sharks, they don't like estuaries. They're visual predators. Often the estuary water is a little too turbid for them. They like to hit a seal from below. And they're not very deep. So if you're trying to hit a seal from below, just why would you want to be in a 5-foot or 20-foot deep estuary? So the other sharks might get in, but they don't, like 7-gill sharks in San Francisco Bay, but they don't prey. A 7-gill shark, although they'll apparently take a harbor seal occasionally, there's no evidence of 7-gill sharks taking sea otter. So relatively prey-rich, shark-safe, these estuaries, which could act as stepping stones to get new populations started on the north coast or the south coast of California. And from there, maybe start to venture out into the ocean, knock down the sea urchin population, let the kelp forest come back. And then, as you said earlier, Jack, that kelp forest canopy provides protection from the sharks.
And
They just need us to help them leap. They just need to leap over Ano Nuevo with our assistance, and instead of having to go through the gauntlet of sharks there.
So they make it through. The sharks are seasonal because the elephant seals are seasonal.
Yeah.
So in the summer, it's pretty safe to make the swim. In fact, one sea otter pup was released, orphan sea otter pup raised by the Monterey Bay Aquarium was released and made it the 120 kilometers to Drake's Estero at Point Reyes National Seashore. It was actually a female, which shocked everybody. It wasn't enough to get the population started. So you get these occasional dispersers that make it through the shark gauntlet, or lucky and they do it in summer when the shark population is low. But the dispersal from estuary to estuary would be probably have to be in summer until those kelp forest canopies come back and give them the shelter, as they provide shelter to the seals too.
And then what about the effect? I'm always one note is for me always get the commercial enterprises out of national parks and national forests and wilderness areas, of course, and that's always the fight. But oyster company, does that do any harm when you're having these filthy boats making all their noise, no judgment, polluting the water and pulling animals out to eat them? So clams and oysters,
or consumption of their product.
So 70% of our oysters are farmed in Humboldt Bay. Humboldt Bay would be a great estuary for sea otter. Tomales Bay would be a great estuary for sea otter. Has another oyster farm. They are a potential threat. However, a recent publication of oyster aquaculture on the Alaskan coast, they put metal cages around their oyster
beds,
seeds, and there was no otter predation. So it could be mitigated. They can coexist. They actually look with the sea otter just hanging around these metal caged oysters. They didn't even hang around more. They're smart. They go for where prey's easy getting.
As you say, Kate, it's like, underwater fences to protect the commercial agriculture. You take wild animals, convert them to domesticated for profit, and then you have to kill all the wild animals, because they're now a threat to your trapped animals that we eat. Yeah. This is why I turned vegan. I mean, I'm not pulling you into our vegan world, but I just see the same thing again. Metal fences underwater as well.
And so I'm not a huge fan of this let's put huge farms of oysters in metal. I'm not a huge fan of that. I just read a paper literally in the last week, a scientific publication, something like 25% of Norway's wild salmon now have farm salmon genetics. So they're escaping from the salmon farms, obviously, and they're changing
weakening the genetics.
Weakening the genetics, what Skyler said. Yes. Thank you,
so
Skyler.
I'm not, but there Oregon did a study of the economic benefit versus the impact to Dungeness crab or oyster aquaculture, and the wildlife viewing just greatly outweighs by high multiples the economic loss. All the Dungeness crab fishers have to do is fish deeper water. Sea otter don't typically go more than, they can go deeper than 30 meters, but they typically don't. So just fish deeper water for Dungeness crab and put cages around your oysters. I would happily donate money if oyster farmers needed some money to get their cages, just to help, if they would agree to let us put sea otter in Tomales Bay, which would be a great place to get them started. But Drake's Estero, in our analysis, so Turtle Island Restoration Network, another intern was writing about sea otters, and then they asked me to help, and we looked at the estuaries in Northern California. There's about a dozen, including San Francisco and San Pablo Bay, but then up the coast till you get to Crescent City Harbor, there's about a dozen estuaries that would be great stepping stones to restart sea otters. In my view, Drake's Estero is the best one. It's a wilderness area. There's no negative for aquaculture there. B, there's 2 estuaries to its north and 2 estuaries to its south. So it's just kind of a double launch pad. If we could get southern sea otters established in Drake's Estero, they could go north to Tamales Bay and then Bodega Harbor. And they could go south to Bolinas Lagoon and then San Francisco Bay.
Gee, it'd be a shame if somebody just came in the middle of the night and dropped a few southern sea otters into Drake's Estero. I wouldn't want that to ever happen.
They'll get shot.
Well,
hey, I've
been asked. I mean,
no, the otters will get shot by the industrial.
If they find them, what were you going to say, Rick?
It's a pretty long gauntlet to Tamales Bay from Drake's Estero. You got to go all the way around Point Reyes. It's 40 kilometers to the entrance of Tamales Bay. You got big concentrations of, you got elephant seal rookeries, which would bring a lot of sharks, both on the Tamales Point Bird Rock as well as Chimney Rock and Drake's Beach. So I think it would take a long time for the population to build up and reach Tamales Bay. But south, they could go south, I think, pretty readily to Bolinas Lagoon and then to San Francisco Bay, where the sea otters in San Francisco Bay, they'd have to contend with boat traffic and all kinds of anthropomorphic stress. But there's already publications that Richardson's Bay, North San Pablo Bay, the Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge in South San Francisco Bay, relatively safe places probably for sea otter if they found their way back.
So
hey,
politics
people who are listening, we're coming close to an hour. If you have questions, because it's great to have Rick here, this is your chance. Start posting them in the comments so that we can fit them in before the show is over. Sorry.
Thank you, Skyward. No, that's great. It's important. No, so politics aside, Rick, other than, you've got to do things through the proper channels and the Park Service, you got to go through NPS and all that to get stuff into Point Reyes Seashore. If you could just get those orphaned sea otters that Monterey Bay has, the aquarium, and say, well, I would just, transport them magically with whatever money and put them somewhere, that would be Drake's Estero. You just put them there and see how they do.
Right now, they're raising up these orphan sea otters at the Monterey Bay, and they're giving them to zoos because there's no place, because we're not translocating them to our coastline where the kelp forest is gone. I should also have mentioned quickly, in estuaries, there's another trophic cascade. They eat the crabs, that eat the sea hares or sea snails that clean the eelgrass leaves. So if you knock the crab population down, the sea hare and sea snail population goes up, the eelgrass leaves get cleaned, and in Elkhorn Slough, the eelgrass has come back. It's like 4x what it used to be. And guess what? That's also a nursery for all kinds of little finfishes and all kinds of other critters that need shelter from the big, the larger predators. So
it's not just that we have habitat available or that we have orphans that need homes. The trophic cascades desperately need these animals to be there. And we have 3 reasons listed right there, and yet we aren't jumping on the opportunity.
So the sea otter, because they're federally listed, we have to get over 3,096 a year, 3 years in a row to get delisted. So because they're listed on the good news is they're protected. The bad news, it's really hard to get a translocation approved.
Whoa. So, okay.
Being protected prevents them from being helped.
Talk more about that. That's new to my ears, maybe Skyward's too, but it's certainly new to my idea. Because it's protected, you just can't move them willy-nilly. It's a whole big labyrinthine bureaucracy to get them moved if they're listed.
Correct. So beaver aren't listed, and the approvals would be less difficult.
Okay.
I would say if you get a tribal sponsor and you get
Congressman Huffman, would Huffman be an ally on this? That's politics question, but any idea?
I'm not. You're out. I know that he's a sea otter fan. I know that he pushed in Congress to require Fish and Wildlife to do a feasibility assessment, and they said yes, it is feasible, and you should start in estuaries, create these little stepping stones that would begin to reseed the north coast and bring our kelp forest back.
Were you going to say you would answer that question, but you're kind of out of your depth with the politics of Huffman? And I was going to say, hey, being out of my depth has never stopped me before. What are you, a scientist?
Exactly.
Unlike you don't actually have a backup of knowledge. You just have blowing smoke. Rick Rick actually has knowledge we can go to instead of him blowing smoke.
Correct. Thank you, Skylar. Same as you, Woody. Take that. Same to you and many more. So, I mean, for me, as an activist, I'm looking for an issue like this is a no-brainer. It's a win-win, and I can go to a politician like Huffman and actually have him as an ally for change, as opposed to an opponent, who is good for him. People love these animals, whether it's beaver or sea otter. There'd be huge public support, and that's what activists do: is raise the temperature so that people want this, and there's no good reason not to. There's not even like some opposing business interest that's going to get hurt by this. It's just dealing with the bureaucracy, right?
Elkhorn Slough's 100 miles from San Francisco. They're making 10 or 12 million a year in this rent a kayak and go see the sea otter. Point Reyes is 45 miles from San Francisco and hour and a half from 2 international airports. People are already coming to see the elephant seals and the elk herds. Now the elk are up to 828. It is becoming the Yellowstone of the Pacific, but you don't have to go 1,000 miles to go see it.
Yellowstone meaning biodiversity, not necessarily size. It's tiny by comparison, but it's big enough. Certainly, it's 71,000 acres total to host these species we're talking about, sea otter and beaver,
right?
For instance,
right. You go to Yellowstone to see the wildlife. It's wildlife watching, and the ecotourism benefits would be dramatic with sea otter.
Just as here, ecotourism is already bringing in a lot more money to Point Reyes than the few wealthy farmers who are running beef and dairy. Well, it used to be dairy cows, beef cows.
Hear about it, which is what I was going to say. Like Rick, even in the video I was listening to this morning, and you've given examples today, and then of course we have the examples from our work in Point Reyes about how the elk draw in much more money than the ranchers ever produced, and yet all we ever hear is economic collapse without what the output of the ranches. We don't ever hear about the money that ecotourism is producing. It's like it's intentionally being subdued.
Yeah,
crazy, huh? Because it is.
Unfortunately, I have to jump. I would love to talk to you guys more. Thank you for helping educate the world.
Thank you.
I publish this stuff in the scientific literature, and nobody reads it. And I think we have opportunities to do something really unique at Point Reyes now, thanks to the Nature Conservancy. And we just need to push a little further. So thanks again.
Thank you, Rick. Really appreciate your coming on.
You're welcome back as soon as you are available.
If you dare.
If you dare. Thank you, Jack. I have to run too, so that works out great.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And by the way, Skylar and I are still discussing next week. It may or may not be the Owl Queen. I will have a discussion with Skylar, and we'll let you know what's going on. Thank you for tuning in today. We'll see you next week, 10 o'clock as always. Skylar Thomas for Watching Humans, and me, Jack Gescheit, for the Tree Spirit Project, blowing smoke up everyone's behind. I don't know.